Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for joining us today. I've been told by our team that we have over 100 attendees joining us, so I'll just give it a minute or so everyone can join the call, and then we'll begin. Thank you. Thanks for your patience. Hello again, and thank you for joining us today for the latest session in our Alder Intelligence series. For those of you who haven't attended one of our previous webinars, my name is Jack Myers, and I'm Senior Account Manager here at Alder, and I'll be chairing today's panel discussion. Alder is a specialist crisis communications consultancy in London with particular expertise in the education and charity sectors. And our partners advise education clients on a range of issues, including but not limited to fatalities, injuries, non-recent abuse cases, changes in leadership, inspections, inquests, arrests, and criminal trials. Today's education sector webinar is on protecting your reputation, trends, best practice, and lessons from recent cases. And we'll be focusing on insights and action points arising from sector intelligence from our specialist education team, as well as specific experience from casework. We'll be discussing a number of emerging trends, including culture war debates, mental health, non-recent abuse cases, and mental health and safety cases. Many of you will be familiar with some of those themes, either from recent experience or media coverage. So what I'm looking to focus on today's discussion on is not only an overview of those issues, but more importantly, the mitigation strategies that can be employed to minimize reputational risk. We obviously take client confidentiality extremely seriously. So obviously all case studies and insights will be anonymized throughout. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. We will be recording this session. If you'd like a copy, we will be circulating an email following today's session with details on how you can access that. In terms of the structure, we'll keep things conversational, hopefully 40 to 45 minutes, which will allow some time for questions at the end. To those of you who have already submitted questions in advance, thank you very much. If at any point any of you as attendees do wish to submit questions, you can do so via the Q&A box, which you should be able to find on the Zoom panel toolbar. We won't obviously be discussing any specific cases, but if you do have a question, do please submit those and we'll address those at the end. So without further ado, let me just introduce our panel. We have Tim Toulmin. Tim Toulmin is Managing Director here at Alder and heads up our education practice. He advises schools on how to manage the communication demands of tricky issues, including sudden incidents, employment issues, and safeguarding matters. And also we have today Sue Bishops, who is our specialist education partner. Her most recent role was as Director of External Relations at the Headmasters and Headmistresses Conference, where she led on crisis and other external communications, including through the last election and COVID. And before that, she was a journalist, including on Newsnight and at Mirror Group newspapers. Thank you both for joining us today. So I'm going to start with a question to you, Tim, just to set the scene. Would you be able to outline for me just 3 key trends that you're seeing today in day-to-day crisis management in schools?
Thanks, Jack. Yes, well, it has been a very intense period for media scrutiny of schools recently. And those of you who've heard us talk before will remember that we're often talking about the distinction between the sort of behavioural issues that give rise to stories like Everyone's Invited, BLM, internal issues around bullying and so on, and then sudden incidents that could be fatalities accidents, and so on. And we've always said really that it's the former category that create the most stories in terms of number, and that while people should be concerned about the sudden incidents, they are very rare. So what we've seen, one of the trends this year, which is very distressing in a way, but certainly noteworthy, is that there have been a high number of stories involving sudden incidents, fatalities, serious injuries, and so on. We'll come on to the learning about that in a minute. Second point is behaviour change, and that goes to two different points. Firstly, the behaviour within educational settings, not just pupils, but also staff as well, has led to a different type of news story and a different type of scrutiny. And thirdly, talking of behaviour, I think we should also touch this afternoon on the behaviour of the media and changing trends in the way that they're gathering information as well. So they're my top three observations of trends over the last few months.
Thanks, Tim. And we'll obviously be going into a bit more detail on a couple of those trends, but just to bring in Sue here, I mean, similarly in terms of sector trends, could you just give me kind of three key issues that the education sector is facing?
Yes, thank you, Jack. I'm going to focus just at the beginning here on sort of the political and financial environment, because it's so febrile at the moment, and many of the issues we're going to be talking about will be directly relevant to both the state and the independent sector. But this particularly is relevant, of course, to independent schools because it relates to the fact that we're in an election year, of course, with VAT on school fees being a lightning rod issue within that, which is really significant, both in and of itself as an issue and how it brings schools into the public eye. So you'll have seen probably the stories this week in the Eye saying that, claiming that Labour will be bringing in this policy almost immediately if it comes into power, and it does look as if they're coming to power, but who knows. That's really worst case scenario for independent schools, and it comes alongside a lot of concerns about fees, of course, because there have been a lot of scare stories out there, namely, Mail Online saying that it could cost £835,000 to send a child to an independent school throughout the term of their education. Not something necessarily that most people on this call would recognise, but nevertheless, it does lodge. At the top end, fees are on 50,000 plus now, and parents have got cost of living issues. So that's one whole bag of things. Secondly, in there is the teacher pension scheme, and the fact that, again, a national announcement is being awaited at the moment, which means that the contribution in the sector could go up to as much as 29% from 23.8 in one go, and that will trigger a lot more schools having to either do a phased withdrawal or just come out of TPS, which will, maybe calm and maybe not, but communications is going to be crucial within that. And of course, that's alongside pay. And then mergers, as all these different issues that we're going to be talking about means that the sector is sort of consolidating, and therefore we're seeing a lot of mergers at Alder coming through. Often it's prep and senior schools to protect the prep school and protect the pipeline, but not always. Sometimes they go smoothly and sometimes they do not. And again, as schools who have been through this look back, they do say that they got their communication slightly wrong. So those are some sort of really key issues in that sort of basket.
I just want to pick up then on this political and economic. I mean, you described the climate as febrile. So I'm wondering two things here. Number one is, how is the sector as a whole responding? But also number two, are there specific things that schools can be doing to be managing some of these political issues that are coming up on the horizon?
Yeah, so at sector level, ISBA, which is the Bursars Association, does have a lot of very good guidance on this. So those of you coming straight from schools, your bursars should have guidance. But ISBA itself is very clear that that doesn't necessarily include communications, and professional help is needed in that regard. But they do have some good material on the three issues that I've raised. And David Woodgate, their CEO, is very happy to come to schools and do presentations. I know that, and that's worthwhile. The ISC is tasked, the Independent Schools Council is tasked with media work for the sector and with, lobbying and public affairs. And they really urge that schools fill in their impact assessment templates and so on. So that leaves what do schools do at their level? Well, you'll be aware that open days are coming up, that it would be foolish to imagine that parents haven't noticed what's going on. They will have questions. And some schools have started to plan around this, but a lot haven't. And I guess the messaging really there is to ensure that parents feel that you are on top of this situation, that you are planning, that you will mitigate the effects of all of this as much as possible, and that your child is at the center of everything that you're going to do. You obviously aren't going to be able to talk figures yet, but you can tell them when perhaps to expect another communication from you. Briefly on mergers, you need a proper communications plan for that, which looks at leaks and stakeholders and messaging and everything. And on TPS, a lot of it's about early engagement and balancing the communications between valuing your staff, but there being real realities if you want to keep fees down.
Thanks, Sue. I'm just going to move on to one of those issues that we're already seeing being used as a political wedge issue, and that's culture war debates. So obviously we're seeing schools are increasingly being treated as arenas for culture war debates. So if I first come to Sue for kind of the sector and national overview, I mean, what is happening at a national level and where does this leave schools?
Yeah, so probably, I mean, generally speaking, as Tim mentioned, we're in a post-Me Too, post-Black Lives Matter scenario here, which to some degree is very good because schools have real learning from that, about how to communicate with all their different sort of, both the pressure, all the different views within your own community. But also it does mean, there are activists both inside and outside the school. And activists outside the school are circling, looking at websites, looking at, to sort of try and find evidence to match their agenda and make as much fuss about that as possible, whether it's with journalists or online. Schools are being asked to parent more than they ever have been. That's been a trend for the last few years, and do indeed, and have a lot of pressure on them from schools, from parents rather. And then really the trans issue has to be front of mind at the moment. We're all waiting for that government guidance, and we wait and we wait. In the meantime, the NHS has brought out some guidance, as some of you will know, which including the fact that social transitioning should not take place without parental certainly information being shared with them. And also the Equality and Human Rights Commission has brought out guidance as well. So there's a bit of a sort of rowback going on in this regard. And of course, schools are right in the middle of this.
Right. So here I want to bring in Tim, because I mean, hopefully, there's mitigation to be done here. What sorts of things can schools be adopting regarding, specifically the trans issue, but more broadly, culture war debates that they keep getting dragged into? How do they avoid becoming the headline here?
I think the first thing is to recognise that this is really going to be one of the key flashpoints of the next few months as we go up to this general election, which has already been billed as a culture war election, and schools really are the battleground for it, unfortunately. So step one, recognise that any school could get dragged into this. But if you analyse how they can get dragged into it, that's how you can start to reduce the risk on individual schools. So what does that mean? Well, we've seen journalists who've been engaging in so-called fishing expeditions, for example, sending the same message to a whole bunch of different schools and hoping that someone will respond to them and engage with them with an answer. So an example of that might be, in this context, your ex-school, your policy on trans inclusion has been criticised by a pressure group. What have you got to say about it? Now, that email could be sent to 100 different schools, and all the journalist needs is for one school to respond to get into some sort of artificial row with this pressure group, and then you've got a story. 99 schools could perfectly well ignore it and then not insert themselves into the story in the first place. And of course, once you're in that story, you've then got a whole bunch of communications with your stakeholders on the back of the media story, with your parents, with colleagues, with pupils who might not recognize the way in which the school is being characterized, or you may need to clarify inaccuracies. So it can be a real nightmare to sort of insert yourself by accident into one of these stories. But I think also recognizing that this is a real issue means being honest and open with colleagues, accepting that people do find this type of conversation difficult. So this goes to the importance of facilitating decent conversations internally, perhaps with external facilitators, on what the school's policy actually is. Third, review those policies. They're public facing. People are going to be crawling over them. How are you going to explain, stroke defend what they contain in public if you're one of these schools who is on the receiving end of some scrutiny? And I think also recognise what your local member of parliament's views are likely to be, and analyse how it might come into the public domain and put this particular school into the public sphere. So a few practical things I think that you can do with a bit of forward planning so that you're not caught off guard.
I'm just going to pick you up. That's really helpful, Tim. I'm just going to pick you up there on the forward planning element there, because I know one of the trends we've been seeing recently with schools in particular, which you mentioned earlier, is health and safety cases becoming more prominent in the last year. I mean, how much planning can you do for those sorts of cases? What sort of lessons can we learn from the cases that we've seen this half the year?
I think there are several very important learning points, and perhaps it all comes back to the extent to which the school is already ready. Hopefully, most schools will have a good up-to-date crisis communications manual. That's not a policy, it's a practical guide that sits alongside other documents like your business continuity plan and so on. And in that manual, all sorts of helpful things, checklists of things to do, who's doing what, scenario plans, draft statements, draft stakeholder communications, depending on the scenario, so that you're ready to go in the event that the worst happens. Because one of the things we have seen, and this is increasingly the case with social and digital media, is that you simply have no time to react, and yet you are expected to react. So anything you can do to save time will be important, but also understand roles. And it's on that roles point, I think, that the key learning has been seen this year. When there's a sudden incident, a tragedy, the human response from people in the community is to offer to help. So you might, for instance, have a member, a parent who's a communications expert who says, oh, I must help with the communications. Or you have somebody who's got some specialist knowledge around counselling, or they've got a point of view coming from their professional background, whatever it is. And suddenly it can feel very overwhelming. All these people form part of the crisis team accidentally. The crisis manual will tell you that your crisis response team has to be very small, and it has to have an executive decision-making function within it, because you are expected to communicate at very high speed with a lot of people. So very often the chair of governors here is going to have to be ruthless and say, we have a plan, we're sticking to it. There are these 4 or 5 people in this crisis response team, and everyone else, unfortunately, just falls outside it. So I think specific learning around who is responding. I think ensuring that you learn from others. Look what's happening to other schools. Is our plan ready for what they're going through? And I think the third point is make sure you've got the right advisors lined up for that type of scenario. I think, for instance, one important thing is to make sure you've got the right level of access to counselling in case the community is plunged into a sudden grief moment, for example. And perhaps a final point is check your insurance cover, that it's absolutely up to date with the sort of things that might be going on.
I'm just going to return to a point you made earlier, which I think is really interesting. The idea that fundamentally, when a journalist contacts us, we all want to be helpful. We want to offer honest and transparent views, help people with their inquiries, etc. And obviously that does unfortunately put people in very difficult positions, particularly vis-a-vis journalists. I'm just thinking that the other side of the coin there is that how journalists are behaving, how journalists are making those inquiries, how they're making those approaches. So I wonder again, so just to Tim here first, I mean, so you mentioned schools inserting themselves into stories unnecessarily. How do schools gauge whether or not to respond to a media inquiry? Can you just simply refuse to engage?
Well, I'll come on to that, but the first important point actually is to say that they should at least have the opportunity to decide, by which I mean you need to have a good channel of communication open with journalists so that they can get hold of you. Stories have a habit of happening at antisocial times, and if an inquiry comes in late on a Friday evening, you don't want to leave it until Monday morning to respond, because the whole story might have happened over the weekend. But then I think you can apply a certain filter as to whether to engage or not. And just because a journalist has asked a question doesn't mean you have to respond to it, depending on what it is. It could be one of those fishing expeditions. But B, it doesn't mean that you have to give a statement on the record for publication, which very often in its own right effectively gives permission to journalists to publish a story. If there are difficulties with the story, if you don't recognize certain aspects, if certain aspects are likely to intrude into somebody's privacy or possibly defame them, or there is other context that you need to share with the journalist, then that can be shared usually on a background basis, not for publication basis, to explain to the journalist why it's not the story they think it is. Whereas if you go on the record to deny it, then that's pretty much guaranteeing that the story will be published. So there are definitely layers of engagement, I think, with journalists, and that's something to bear in mind when you receive one of these inquiries. Thank you, Tim.
So I mean, are there broader changes in journalist behaviour that you're seeing when they make inquiries to education clients?
There are, yes. I mean, broadly speaking, there are fewer really well, with good exceptions, well-qualified specialists who really build up a lot of contacts over time and really care about education and want to stay in education for a long period of time. And obviously the top sort of broadsheets do have that, but most others do not. There'll be news journalists who are going to crash into something and crash out of it again. Tracking back to the political situation we find ourselves in, that will mean that news journalists and political journalists are more inclined to get involved in stories about independent schools sort of in the coming period. And we saw that in the last election as well. And that is harder to manage for similar reasons. And it is worth knowing what sort of journalist you're dealing with, actually. It also means that potentially broadcast journalists will start being interested in these sorts of stories in a way they might not have been before. And, you know, doing live broadcast is high velocity risk. And also you've got other behaviours such as doorstepping, when they sort of turn up to, you know, literally on someone's doorstep. And we've seen that happen a bit more than we have done before, including, you know, somebody high up at GDST was doorstep during the GDST, you know, the Girls' Day School Trust problems with the strikes. And also we've seen governors doorsteps as well, which actually we haven't seen before. So that requires some, you know, some training up, or at least a note. And there there is a bit of a double-edged sword around the fact that there are fewer well-resourced regionals and news agencies. That can be a problem if you're trying to actually engage positively. But in fact, it does also mean that some court cases and tribunals and so on are going unreported. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Brilliant, thanks. I mean, Tim, is there anything you would add to that in terms of broader changes you're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's useful to bear in mind that some of the broadsheets are getting incredibly well resourced again after many years of not being able to make money because of the internet. Now, what that means is they've got obviously more journalists to play with. They can take longer over their stories, and they can keep returning to things and be real and really sort of be dogs with a bone over certain issues. The other end of the spectrum, you've got probably very inexperienced journalists and not being paid very much money, and they don't really know what they're doing, and they've been plunged into dealing with a story involving a tragedy. Now, what we've seen is a number of examples of these types of people being incredibly crass and just sort of very empathetic, not realizing that people are dealing with a tragedy. So that goes to the way in which they will approach a school for comment. They'll say somebody's died, they'll say, I need a picture of this dead person by 11 o'clock this morning. Literally as brutal as that. Unbelievably sort of, just crass. I can't think of any other way of putting it, insensitive. But it also goes to a sort of lack of knowledge of boundaries, physical boundaries. And we've had journalists turning up at school premises again, and a slight backsliding in standards, I think. What does that actually mean? Well, we obviously can't do anything about the training of journalists, but we can certainly do something about our response to that potential eventuality. And that, again, goes to the need for media training. And by media training, we don't mean just the traditional sit down in a broadcast studio and get grilled, but also training around every way in which you might get approached by a journalist to ensure that your response is as front-footed as possible and you're not caught off guard.
I suppose one time when schools least want journalists to come knocking on the door is when an incident relates in some regards to mental health. And so, Sue, I'm wondering, do you have a sense of the trends that we're seeing in the sector with regards to mental health there?
Yes, on a broad level, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that young people are living their lives online, and some of those behaviours and some of those influences that they're coming across online are having an impact on how they're behaving offline. And schools are finding some really extraordinary behaviours around this, and in both whether it's in the school dormitory or whether it's the things like Andrew Tate symbols being used in school photographs. There's all kinds of things going on there that schools need to be very aware of, because it is part of the whole scenario whereby young people are really unsure of what they're supposed to be doing. Broadly, in terms of mental health, we know we're in a situation where 1 in 6 young people between the ages of sort of 3 to 16 have got a mental health condition that would be considered to be a mental health condition these days. I mean, that is an extraordinary statistic. And very sadly, we know that death by suicide does happen, and that is the worst possible situation you can come across. So broadly speaking, the associations are doing as much work as they can in this respect, but when it comes to school level, schools are very much sort of on their own, really.
Thanks, Sue. So just to then talk about school level then, I mean, Tim, how are mental health issues manifesting themselves in terms of the challenges that schools are having to manage?
I think it's not just pupils, it's staff, it's also parents, and post-lockdown, post-COVID, I think there is this lingering sense of people lacking resilience and anxiety being everywhere. That, in terms of parents, that means what once might have been dealt with in a relatively reasonable way suddenly becomes a big drama. They threaten to go to the press at the drop of a hat. In terms of staff, it means we're seeing some quite strange behaviour, which ends up with people being suspended and investigated for matters. And then the challenge is, of course, that classic one, which all the lawyers on here will recognise, of how do you explain that somebody is not there when it's very obvious they're not there, but you can't tell them why, you can't tell the community really why they're not there. So that's been a very delicate tightrope walk for quite a few schools. As behaviours really, and this is bad behaviours, change since lockdown. So we're seeing new forms of bad behaviour. You'll forgive me if I don't go into specific detail on that particular point, but people, I'm sure, on this call will recognise that. And then there's the behaviour that's happening within school children, not just the self-harm that Sue mentioned, but also peer-on-peer bullying and strange criminal, often, behaviour online. So schools are all of a sudden having to face this whole new set of challenges. And because they're novel, they're newsworthy if they get out. I think the saving grace is that anything around mental health, most things around employment and so on, are subject to such a high degree of confidentiality that newspapers and journalists are going to struggle really to report them unless there's an overwhelming public interest. But that doesn't mean to say it's not a stakeholder management issue, because people in the community will be aware of certain things, certainly rumours, and therefore plans will have to be advanced as to how to deal with those, because you can't just not hear a question posed by a member of staff or a parent.
Thanks, Tim. At this point, I just want to move on to a different theme here, just because I know that in our kind of day-to-day work, there are obviously very harrowing cases regarding non-recent abuse that bring with it kind of a number of issues and decisions that schools have to make. I mean, chief among them are, how do you respond to victims of non-recent abuse? I mean, obviously, the context of that is the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse published its final report nearly a year ago now. But maybe to Tim first here is, I mean, what should schools prioritise when managing victims of non-recent abuse?
Well, I think the general guiding principle has always got to be what's in the victim's interest. And I think this is something that has finally changed in the sector post the independent inquiry or during it. And that's very welcome. Most schools do recognise that protecting their reputation, if that's their chief concern, actually means protecting the victim first. And if you look after a victim and put their interests first, you're very unlikely to have much of an impact on your reputation. You'll be judged by the way that you respond to one of these things. There's a very old-fashioned attitude, which is what gave rise in part to the independent inquiry itself, which is, let's just cover it up, hope it goes away. Let's just quieten them down. Let's not apologize. Let's not engage. Let's not investigate. Unfortunately, this left victims in a terrible position and caused considerable mental health and other problems for them, relationship problems, all sorts of things. What we're seeing now, in parts, is incredibly encouraging. And I sort of hesitate at this point because I know there are some lawyers on, but you will forgive me because I know some of you have been doing some brilliant work in how you're helping schools to communicate with their communities, with their old pupils, and just acknowledge that things were not great in the past, and encourage them to speak out, give them a voice, explain how to make disclosures and so on. Now, the reason I'm chuckling about the lawyers is that they will be, I can almost hear them saying, don't do anything like that without the closest and best legal advice. And I would absolutely endorse that, because of course there are traps along the way, but schools are finding a way, and that's really great for the victims, and it's also great for the reputation of the school. Conversely, there are one or two still, bizarrely in this day and age, examples we've seen, not clients of ours, I hasten to add, who do still brush victims off. They cover things up. they're party to old cover-ups, and they deliver, so far as they try to get out of it, non-apology apologies. This is the sort of thing that schools need to be wary about, because it's that type of behaviour, given that the rest of the sector is starting to get really good at victim engagement, that is going to draw more scrutiny and criticism of individual schools, because that behaviour will increasingly look like an aberration.
So it sounds like from what you're saying there, Tim, so it's slightly polarized approach to how people are schools are managing victims of non-recent abuse. So I mean, so is there an agreed approach from sector on how to support victims?
I think it would be hard to claim that. There has been some fantastic work done, notably by the Boarding Schools Association, actually during and after the independent inquiry, ICSA, in particular. And there's one paper that actually I would draw your attention to, called Supporting Victims and Survivors of Abuse, which has an English and a Scottish version. Now, that is a paper that was written by a head, actually, who'd been through the flames and back on this, and then reviewed by experts. And it is a paper that was only available to associations, but Robin Fletcher, the chief executive of the Boarding Schools Association Group, has said that anyone who's interested, who is on this webinar, he's willing to share it with them, and we'll give Robin's address email address at the end of this. And they do have a commitment to care charter as well. But of course, it's not just boarding schools; it's day schools that are going to be coming up against these issues as well. And with that in mind, there is an organisation called SACPA, which is the Safeguarding and Child Protection Association, which is underneath the Boarding BSA umbrella, which I think basically any organisation can join, and they have a lot of resources as well. And one of the things there is terminology, given that we're talking partly about communications here, where we'll have to be so careful around phrases like historic abuse, non-recent abuse is something that victims often prefer, and even the phraseology around victims, is, some are perfectly happy to be referred to as such, and some are not. And closure as well. These phrases are all really important to get right, because if you don't at the beginning, then it can just create distance between you and the people that you're trying hard to communicate to and about. So I hope that's useful, because it's a big subject.
No, absolutely. It's a massive subject. And I suppose just to extend it a little bit further. So it sounds like you're in broad agreement of the importance of prioritizing victims in communications. So, I mean, I wonder, so just to Tim here first, I mean, we're also seeing a general trend in education cases involving either the criminal justice system or the TRA. Does that victims first approach still hold for live cases, for example, ones that are still under either police investigation or subject to open legal proceedings?
Well, a word about the state of the criminal justice system is that, as I think is known to many of us, it's in a terrible state. There are lots of delays baked in, and that means that justice is very often denied for victims. So, of course, it makes engagement much more difficult, and it's of course not going to be appropriate to communicate directly with the victim whilst those proceedings are active. But you can certainly use the police, I think, to help frame your likely response. You can help the way you engage with the police is likely to be passed on to the victim, and if they understand that the school is taking matters seriously and has a high degree of empathy for the victim, and may as proceedings draw to an end, be looking to, with permission, contact them to apologise, say what they can do to support them, etc., that we've seen that often land very well with victims, but the problem is that it's just such a long time between the disclosure and the trial. And there's one further point to make about that. Because of the delays that are baked in, and because of other changes in the rules around reporting of arrests, we're much more cautious about stakeholder comms of these sorts of cases now, because previously schools would want to be quite proactive about it. Now it's much more wait and see, because it could well be that you think you're about to have a hearing involving a former member of staff, for example, and the whole thing just gets punted back by several months at the last minute. On the TRA, these are gift for journalists. So journalists love just copying and pasting TRA findings. So really the lesson there is, if you are aware that a former member of staff is involved and your school might be identifiable, then make sure that you have planned for that, because the journalist can just reproduce that information at a moment's notice.
Thanks for that, Tim. In a moment, we'll move on to questions that we've received from the floor. But before we do that, I wonder whether, if either Sue, Tim, you have any final thoughts that you'd just like to share with everyone today? Maybe if I go to Sue first, any final thoughts?
Yes, thanks, Jack. I guess it's important to remember that reputation does actually matter, that it's something which, in your risk registers and your planning, really does need to come to the fore, especially this year. I mean, it's an invisible asset, but actually it is a very valuable one. I mean, there's very good research from people like Deloitte that have worked out that, reputation is worth between sort of 20 to 35% of total value of your organization. And actually it's a lot more in not-for-profits. So that is worth thinking about. And as is the fact that the associations, I mean, Julie Robinson, for example, from the ISC has noted and is happy to be quoted as saying that communications planning is going to be very, very completely critical this year, in the way that critical incident planning or financial planning is. So I think that's really important. This is a crunch year, so plan.
Thanks, Sue. And Tim, any final thoughts?
Just, I think, task somebody internally with owning crisis communications as a policy, as a separate area. Learn from others, look at the news, what's going on, would we be able to deal with that, and update your plans, make sure you've got the right advisors in place accordingly, and also recognize that this isn't just going to protect your reputation, important though that is, it will also protect you, your people. Psychologically, you will feel very much better if you're front-footed whilst dealing with a crisis, rather than trying to deal with it entirely reactively.
Thank you both. I'm keenly aware of the time, so I think we only have time to just answer one question. What I would say, though, is any questions that we're unable to answer here and now, we will definitely answer over email. We have received a question which touches upon something that you mentioned, Tim, earlier, and it's basically about media engagement again. The question really asks, when is it appropriate, or is it ever appropriate, to respond to a media request with no comment? And also, I suppose the question also asks how can you identify a fishing expedition? Maybe if you could just summarize for us what a fishing expedition is, and what classically looks like.
Yeah, well, just to repeat what I said before, really, a fishing expedition really is when a journalist is asking the same question of a lot of different schools, hoping that someone will bite on the hook and give them a response that they can use and publish, and that will be taken as the official response. And then when you see the article, they might say, for example, that they're just going to, this is one case study of many, and they're just interested in best practice in your school. And then, in fact, it turns out that there's a very critical article just about your school. There aren't any other case studies at all, and you've basically waded into a story that you didn't need to. The other example might be that schools here recognise On Everyone's Invited, that website. Loads of schools got the same inquiry, which is, your school's on this website, what have you got to say about it? Well, they probably hadn't even checked it out. They're just taking a punt on the fact that the school was likely to be on the website. So schools responded in different ways. They pushed back, they ignored it, or they pushed back to say to point out the difficulties of the story. But those that commented then were the ones that were very often flagged in the media. So that's a couple of examples of that. On no comment, it's inadvisable to say no comment, because that will be taken as your comment. What you probably want to, people often say that when they are taken by surprise. It's much better to say, if that is the case, to a journalist, I'm not the right person to speak to you about this, or this isn't the right time, I'm just in the middle of something or on the way to somewhere, but we will definitely get back to you. Let me have your details, and someone will do that. If you say no comment, you won't have any opportunity to influence the story, because they will just take that as your official response. We do some training around this, as some of you will know, and it's a useful discipline to work up, because human beings very often want to say something in response to a question put, and it can be a bit artificial to learn how to basically engage with someone in a way that isn't helpful or answering their question.
Brilliant. Many thanks for that, Tim. And thank you both to Sue and Tim for attending today. It's been a really interesting session. Also to all our attendees, thank you very much for attending. Obviously, this webinar has been the latest session in our Alder Intelligence series. If you have any further questions or would like a copy of today's webinar, our team will be getting back with a summary of today's discussion, plus a copy of a recording of the webinar. And equally, if you would like a discreet, no obligation call about any crisis communication support, you'll have our contact details in that email also. Thank you very much, everybody. Hope you have a lovely afternoon, and take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.